Okay, Micah Sifry, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here, Marc.
Well, I asked you to join us because you and I have known each other for 30 some odd years, about 30 years. I think we met in New Hampshire in 1992 during
That could be in
during
a
the Clinton campaign.
during the Clinton campaign, sitting in a diner somewhere, and I think
It-
both Dick Gephardt and Bob Kerrey came over to commiserate about how poorly they were doing in the primary that night.
Yes, and you and I were embarked on a strange. Well, you were embarked on a strange project, which I sort of immediately joined. Which was, if I remember, was none of the above. Is that wasn't
Yes,
that
that
your?
was one of the things I was pushing at that time, that we need a
Yeah,
binding none of the above option on the ballot. Still
yeah.
believe it.
All right. So what we're going to talk about today is the progressive organization and whether it exists or not, where it should go,
Yeah.
uh, what do progressives, leftists, liberals, good Democrats, bad Democrats, how do we move forward? Do we have organization? And if we do, what does it look like? Okay. So
Mhm.
I'm gonna throw you a question that probably should come up in the middle of the conversation, but I'm going to start it with this. Uh, During the Trump administration, one of the most visible uh, resistance groups was Indivisible,
Mhm.
which I think a lot of our people know what it is. You might want to fill in some of the gaps, but here's the deal. Uh, I got in the last 10 days, maybe, I've gotten 3 emails from Indivisible, which I'm not active in, okay, but I'm on their mailing list. And really, when I looked at those emails, they didn't seem very different than the fundraising emails that I get from Nancy Pelosi or the Republican Senatorial Committee. They basically said, oh, well, here's the issue. They're telling me what the issue is today. And please call your senators and congressmen
Right.
to to do this. And by the way, you can drop us a donation, right?
Right.
Is this the infrastructure that progressives have or that we need? I mean, is that it?
No, it's not well, first of all, it's not what we have only, and it's certainly not what we need. But it is a kind of you might think of this as a landscape filled with uh, a certain weed that has spread
Okay.
over a desert, because it's an adaptation, and it isn't sufficient, but it lives off a land that feeds it enough to keep going. So
Hmm.
I have to unpack that.
Yeah. What is this?
Um,
What is this weed you're
yeah, well, the
discussing?
thing is, I mean, just first to just stay with Indivisible for a second, and then to pull back. In 2016, the Trump victory was a shock to a lot of people, um, not necessarily to people who were politically active on the left or the liberal side of things before then, but to a particularly a group of people who hadn't been that active before, some of which were strong
Right.
Hillary supporters, women,
Right.
really thought that this was a moment of historic change that was about to happen. And the idea that, she was rejected, and that this misogynist, racist, et cetera, somehow won was a huge shock. And that led to the women's marches,
Right.
which were largely organized organically through Facebook. And yes, there was a national leadership that was sort of sutured on with the help of Harry Belafonte and some other people, so that it wouldn't just be white women leading the march. But that whole thing was an organic explosion, like a howl of rage, and millions of people marched. But the
Right.
interesting thing is that lots of people were already in motion on their own in response to Trump's victory locally. And many of them started circulating a Google Doc that a couple of congressional staffers named Ezra Levin, Leah Greenberg, and some of their friends, young congressional staffers, who had lived through the Tea Party years, working for Democrats, being browbeated by all of these Tea Party right-wingers. And they had absorbed a lesson from that, which is the way to block Congress from doing something, in this case, the Tea Party blocking the Obama agenda, was organize at the congressional district level, show up at town hall meetings, make a lot of noise, and you can be a blocking force.
Right.
So this Google Doc, which came to be known as the Indivisible Guide, was something that Leah and Ezra and some friends cobbled together in the weeks after Trump's victory. And then they just posted it online thinking this might be useful.
Right.
Little did they know that it would take off, partly because there really was a vacuum of leadership. The major liberal organizations, whether it was the party organizations or the big, other than the ACLU, which like right away jumped out of the gate and said, we'll see you in court, President Trump.
Right.
Which, by the way, they raised a huge amount of money as a result of that.
Of course.
There was a vacuum of leadership and a moment of, a lot of people looking around like and realizing, oh my God, there is no one, it's just us. We better get active. And the Indivisible Guide gave a lot of those people a template. Start a local group, focus on your congressman, hold, whether it's a Democrat who you can push or a Republican who you can try and stop. That was the idea. And very quickly, thousands of these groups formed, and the Indivisible website started out with just the guide and a map that anybody could add their group to. And if you went to that map and typed in your zip code, you could find the group near you. Yeah. So at the very beginning, it was just a clearinghouse. There was no national organization whatsoever. And Leah and Ezra actually said in the original guide, we have no intention of forming an organization. We're just putting this out there. Run with it if you want.
Right.
And I think a lot of people like that as well. And that then, what happened with this grassroots explosion is a story we can unpack further. But the most important thing for the moment is that thousands of local grassroots Democrats connecting to each other, meeting face to face, and doing this in libraries and churches and union halls or whatever, their living rooms. This was like a flood of fresh water onto a Democratic desert.
Right.
I mean, outside of the big cities and college towns, there are just very few places where liberal-minded people meet each other regularly to do politics.
Correct.
And the National Democratic Party and many of the state parties only come to life, like
around election
2 or 3
cycles.
months before an election.
Right.
It's like the desert suddenly comes to bloom because there's money, i.e. water, coming in, and especially if you're in a swing state, you experience this.
Yeah, and then 2 weeks after the election, it goes back to a desert.
It goes back to the desert. The one thing that is retained is names on lists. Right? Because they're your donors and they're the people who now get those emails asking for more money.
Right.
What Indivisible represented, which was new and important, is in many places that had been basically lacking this kind of activity. Now you have regular groups of people meeting, and not just in blue districts, but also purple districts and red districts. I think, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, that a big part of the reason why the Republican Party has maintained a certain resilience isn't just that the Koch brothers and, there were a couple of billionaires with long-range vision that keep pouring money into these things, but it's also that you have churches, gun clubs, Christian mom homeschooling circles, and that locally there's a lot of just ongoing social connection that keep people engaged. There's a lot of evidence that people don't enter political activity because they're really ideological. It's more that their friends pull them in. And friendship is the thing that keeps you and in fact, can make you more ideological, not the other way around.
Micah, let me try and take some of this and apply it on the ground. You have written extensively, and we don't need to recap it in detail. I'll just assert that you have been quite critical of the opportunity missed by Obama
Right.
uh, in 2008, where he did build through their quite uh, efficient website,
Hmm.
uh, millions of people engaged in the campaign,
Right.
able to talk to each other as well, not just send money, able to organize. And after the election, Obama uh, did not, if you will, did not help activate that or continue that activity at the grassroots level. It became a top down uh,
Right.
advocacy and fundraising tool
It
for
was the
Obama.
communications arm of the White House, not much more.
Exact, exactly. So that was stillborn in a way. Uh, Bernie Sanders in 2016, we can skip over a little bit because he ran again in 2020. It's my impression that in 2016, there was an effort, whether it be by Sanders himself or his supporters, to maintain some of that organization after the election, after he was defeated in the primaries.
Yeah.
Uh, what happened this time around, 2020? Is there did the Sanders campaign, which did not do as well as it did in 2016, but still did pretty well from a progressive perspective?
Yeah.
Uh, is there infrastructure that
So,
that was
well,
created and that continues to work or not? It,
so there are a lot of people who were inspired by Bernie Sanders, um, who have stayed involved in political organizing. Uh, Certainly, the big expansion in the Democratic Socialists of America as a membership organization. I think it's five
80,
times as big as it used to be, or something. And
more. It's about 80,000
80,
supposedly.
well, yes, and I think it used to be about 15 or 16.
Yeah,
Um, and the in many cities, DSA is active in electoral politics as well as issue organizing in some very meaningful ways. Um, so some of the primary fights that you see, and not just at the congressional level, but at the local level, are DSA driven or in part. Not just DSA, Working Families Party does this as well. There are other groups. But the Sanders campaign apparatus itself, the list, that went to something called Our Revolution, and people who were very close to Sanders were given the job of running it, and there were people who were not happy about that. We're not going to go into all of that. It was, I mean, Bernie Sanders, I have watched and known, for since his early years in Vermont,
right, right,
and am well aware that all his years in Vermont, he only built a personal organization. He didn't build a political party. He didn't build a progressive movement. It was built on Bernie. There is a progressive party in Vermont,
right.
inspired in part by the fact that he has been successful statewide, and they've gotten very little help from Bernie Sanders. So I didn't expect that we'd see anything all that different this time. And Our Revolution seems to have continued in that path. That said, every presidential campaign does create an opportunity for a lot of like-minded people to find each other and build capacity and infrastructure. The Jesse Jackson campaigns of 84 and 88 did that. Um, and the same is true here. I mean, groups like Justice Democrats are absolutely an outgrowth of the Sanders movement. I would just say, one last thing about what happened with Sanders is um, in 2016, it was him against Hillary. And so there was no other place for
Right,
liberal leftists to go. In
right,
2000, there were more choices. And one, arguably between him and Elizabeth Warren, if the two of them had somehow found a way to, one endorse the other, we might have had a different outcome in 2000
Right,
in the
right.
Democratic primary.
That's
That was
right.
not to be. So the leftover of both of those is at the policy level, you do see some of their people being incorporated by Biden into his transition planning, which is different than what happened in 2008 with
Right,
Obama.
right.
With Obama, the finance wing of the Democratic Party was completely dominant. And, as a result, there's this famous memo that was uncovered in the WikiLeaks leaks of Podesta, where this banker who was involved in the screening process for a lot of Obama's key cabinet appointees in October, even before he's elected, circulates a list, and it's basically exactly the people who were picked
Of
to run
course.
economic policy for Obama.
Of course.
That has not happened this time. And what I would just say that what's different about now compared to 2008, given that Obama dug a big hole and made the Democratic Party weaker over his 8 years, is a lot of people who learned some important lessons. One of which is you don't put all your faith in a politician. There is no cult of personality around Joe Biden the way there was around Barack Obama. Biden doesn't have as big a political base that he controls. The ability to organize independently is far more advanced now among progressive Democrats than it was in 2008.
Well,
So all of these things are different and maybe make me a little more hopeful
yeah,
about the dynamics of between the left and the Democratic Party compared to 12 years ago.
right. I'll just give a small disclaimer to our viewers as we move forward. Uh, it's funny what Micah just said, that he feels more somewhat optimistic from this. As I said, I've known Micah for 30 years. I'm generally more pessimistic than Micah, but I always turn to him when I feel like, oh, there's no hope for anything, because he's more engaged, and he's generally more optimistic, which is good. Uh, Somebody has to be. Uh,
Pessimism of the intellect,
Pessimism,
optimism of the will.
right. And I've attributed that quote to three different people, and I'm not quite sure. I've attributed
Gramsci.
Gramsci, right? Gramsci, Victor Surge, and I forgot who the third one was, but it's
Oh my God.
Gramsci.
Did
Uh,
Victor Surge say that before they cut off his hands? I hope.
I think so. In any case, uh, the question I want to ask now is, if you look at this, some of the debate now around these organizations is a debate about the balance between local organization
Yeah.
and the ability to stay engaged at a local level, right?
Right.
And national organization, because at some point, whatever energies there are in the local areas, I think, need to be translated also into, at times, into political force for policy reasons, right?
Yeah.
I think where you and I completely agree is that organization needs to be independent and not just a satellite
Sure.
of a politician, or in this case of a party, right?
Yeah.
You can feel that you're clearly working to move or work in alliance with or push the Democratic Party, but you don't have to be in a satellite organization to do that. I was reading, you wrote a good piece in the American Prospect, which I will put in our show links here at prospect.org. And the Prospect's doing a series on uh, organizing in the post Trump era. There's a piece in the current issue by Steve Rosenthal, who, if I remember correctly, I think he was the AFL CIO organizing or political director at some.
Political director,
Yeah.
correct. Yeah.
And I just quickly skimmed the piece before speaking to you. I'm going to go back and read it in detail. he said something that really struck me. He said he identified, the 6, 7 areas that really are key to a national election and even to the Senate, right, in 2022. And what he said is, even looking at 2024, we we have to begin organizing yesterday,
Yeah.
today. And he said something that really struck me, which is you have to talk to individuals and people and to organize people. You
Yep.
have to open up those dialogue. That's where I am very pessimistic. Okay. I
Yeah.
agree with that, but I don't see much of that. Do you think that? I know you agree with that. Is that happening?
Well,
Or is it all too insular?
no, I think there's more of it happening, but maybe not enough.
Right.
Um, we're in a deep ditch, and maybe the digging it deeper is stopped, but that doesn't mean that the other process is that far along. Um, there are a lot of bad trends working against the revival of any kind of progressive
Tick, tick,
democrat.
tick those off quickly.
Well, I would say, you have a lot of short-term behavior on the part of the people with money who finance campaigns and political organizations,
Liberal and progressive donors.
liberal and progressive. And even with the rise of small donors, which is a great thing, the fact that 15 million people made a campaign contribution through the Democratic website Act Blue in the last cycle, 10 million of those are new.
Right.
That's a lot of people who have been activated enough to make a small donation. Um, but some of that money was just like poured down the drain in places where, no one was going to beat Mitch McConnell. But how much money did people give to, that race?
Yeah.
And, Susan Collins in Maine, you can think of, some of these big marquee Senate races where hundreds of millions of dollars were transferred to consultants and TV stations through a failing Democratic candidate.
Yeah. They were colloquially pissed away.
Um, well, yes,
Yeah.
and,
Good intentions,
yes,
but
and that
poor strategy.
right, and the fact that that money is available suggests maybe we could divert more of it um, to local organizing. Um, and the good news that I see is a group like the Movement Voter Project, um, which was started in 2015 as a little, as this small effort to just pool progressive donor money to local voter engagement groups that do the work year round in swing states primarily.
Right.
And in 2016, I think they managed to raise 10 million. They moved about $10 million to local groups. The Billy Wimsatt, who started the Movement Voter Project, set a goal of $50 million for 2000. They ultimately moved 100 million.
Right.
They built something
Right.
of some capacity, but 100 million feeding lots of these local groups that need the ability to basically be doing year-round organizing. When you say who is doing what Steve Rosenthal is saying we need to do, which is to talk to people year-round, right? Know them, know what their kitchen table issues are, know when their birthday is, and engage them in, local ways that are meaningful, not only the big national fights. That work is only done at the local level, and for the most part, not done by Democratic Party organizations. So if it's 100 million going into those things now, it's still a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed. And there was 14 billion spent on this last election. I mean, half of that is on the Republican side, but
It's a
still
lot of money. Yeah.
a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
So misdirected money is one of the problems. Another one of the problems is the way the money is spent. We have, since the rise of the internet, the good thing is it's become a lot easier to participate in all kinds of ways. not just donating, but also, sharing things, posting your own stuff. And more people think they're involved in politics when they do that, which is a joke.
Right.
Um, there's a really
Collectivism.
Eitan Hirsch wrote a book. I'm forgetting the name, but his term for it is political hobbyism.
Right. Right.
That if all you're doing is posting on Facebook, it's a very low level of engagement. You maybe influence friends and neighbors a little bit. It doesn't hurt.
Not even anymore because of the way Facebook's
Yeah,
algorithm
exactly.
works. You're
Exactly.
only talking to people you already know. Right.
Well, reinforcing, I'm not going to deny that there is a persuasion effect that can happen when lots of people changed their Facebook profile page to have a rainbow flag, Mark, or to have the equal, the
Yeah.
big marriage equality movement.
Yeah.
There is evidence that helped tip people in the middle
I agree.
who didn't realize. I know people, and the same thing with the Me Too movement.
Okay.
Um, Sharing your personal story um, can really affect other people near you, and that's part of organizing, right?
Right. Of
Listening to other
course.
people's stories and sharing them. So it's not all automatically bad. It's when you think that's enough and you kid yourself that that's how you're being politically active.
Yeah.
That's a weakness. But we have a whole industry built on top of all of this digital behavior. And we have a lot of national organizations, starting with moveon.org, but now everybody does it, that make as a priority building up an email list,
Hurry
figuring
up.
out,
Hurry up. I need $5
right,
today.
or
Right.
or the sky's going to fall.
Right. Well, always. Nancy Pelosi tells me what a horrible situation she is in every
Yeah.
5 minutes.
And that's because there's a Democratic digital firm called Mothership Strategies that
Right.
is actually writing most of those emails. And the reason why people use them is because they actually still bring in money.
Of course.
The problem is that we call this churning and burning.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know enough to realize what is being done here and really think the sky is falling if they don't send $5 and they're in a panic. It's not a good state for building up something meaningful. It is a way to hit your quarterly fundraising target, though.
Yeah.
And that's another problem, is the short-termism and the metrics of impact that people are trying to collect.
Right.
And that I see a lot of those 15 million Democratic donors, and there were something like 4 million people who volunteered to phone bank or text bank, or well, there wasn't much door knocking this cycle, but that's a lot of volunteering. But a lot of those people are also treated as cogs in this larger machine of, we're just going to deliver these people to take an action just when we need them, as
Right.
opposed to building long-term relationships where they actually have some agency,
Right.
right?
And
And so while you may feel good to be given the opportunity to phone bank for Joe Biden, so those phone calls into Georgia didn't hurt,
yeah.
right? But you can have more impact on your own neighbors, the people who you interact with on a regular basis, your coworkers, your friends, people you share a geography with, than people far away.
Right. So let me ask you a question that gets us kind of close to a third rail.
Yeah.
So we can pretend we have technical difficulties if the discussion becomes too difficult. uh, I fully agree with you. I have, as a journalist and even as a citizen overseas, I've seen this type of real grassroots, ground based organizing, right? And of course, a lot of that was in the pre internet
Yeah,
era, too, right?
sure.
So, yeah. Uh, my question to you is if, in fact, this sort of personal contact, right, and kind of local neighbor to neighbor, if you will, or community organizing is indeed so crucial, and I agree with you, doesn't that mean that the activists have a responsibility or people who are going to engage in that. And I'm going to be a little sarcastic here. Uh, don't they have the responsibility to speak the same language as the people they're talking to? And you know what I mean by that.
Yeah, I do know what you mean.
And we can be more explicit. I don't have any problem. But if you talk to some, I live, and I'm going to give you the perfect example. I live in the city of Vancouver, Washington, which has got a population of about 200,000. It's a 50-50 city. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very liberal state, by the way. Washington. The great, I really think the state government here has done a magnificent job on COVID.
Mm-hmm.
We have very progressive legislation. The city that I live in is relatively moderate for Washington because it's 50-50.
Yeah.
We are exactly 10 miles from Portland, which is not 50-50. And we're 10 miles from Portland, but there's a river between us, right? I'm going to be a little unscientific and hyperbolic here. I think that if activists from Portland, who I know some, if they came here and started talking to people
Yeah.
the way they talk to people, I think they get the snot beaten out of them.
Well, I hope they wouldn't get the snot beaten out of them.
That's probably not true, but I don't think they get a very warm reception.
Yeah, well, there's a hothouse culture in a place like Portland that sustains some of what you're talking about. I would just say I'm not the first person to have argued that the word activist should be a dirty word.
Agree. I
And
agree completely.
that it didn't exist, in the until the 1960s, roughly. You
That's
will
right.
not find the word activist used.
Right.
What you see are words that describe a cause. So people who are labor organizers, people who are suffragettes,
Right. Or
abolitionists.
community organizers. There were.
You find the word environmental, these are all connected to the cause that you were actually organizing to win
Right.
something on. And the idea of this sort of free-floating idea of an activist as an identity all on its own has kind of it's a problem because and so I think it's useful to push people to distinguish between activism and organizing.
Correct.
And I think activism is people expressing themselves. Okay, you have a self-interest, and whatever that is, you're expressing it. It makes you feel good to express it. That may be a protest that you need to make, or a demand that you need to make. But whether you're strategic or not is what makes you an organizer. Okay?
Absolutely.
And organizers are constantly trying to figure out, how do we win? Right? And if winning means that you have to get to 50% plus one, then you search for ways to get to 50% plus one. There isn't, I'm not saying there's all activism is bad, by the way. There are people who have on their own sparked movements.
Yes.
When Sam Lovejoy, went and cut down a power line going to a nuclear power plant that was being built in Western Massachusetts, he sparked the anti-nuclear movement. It was
Correct.
a sole act of civil disobedience. He knew what he was taking, the risk he was taking.
Right.
I'm not even all that in favor of individual acts of civil disobedience. They usually don't work. If you're with a group of people, they sometimes work. But strategic is the key differentiator here. So in some places, the language issue that you're alluding to,
Which is a political issue as well.
which is a political choice, it's actually, it has merit. I think it is very good to push people away from their comfort zone as part of a strategy to move them. Sure. But you've got to realize what you're in, which is you're in a game of addition, not subtraction.
Yeah, but that issue of moving people out of their comfort zone, from my perspective, needs to be a two-way street. That is to say, the person, the proactive
Yeah,
part of that organizing formula, right? The
right.
people who are doing the organizing, right? They also have to simultaneously nudge people out of their comfort zone. But to do that, sometimes they have to leave their own comfort zone
That's for sure.
and
I
not edit everything they say in their head, right?
Well, that's fair. I think the amount of time we spend arguing about violations of a using the right language compared to
Speech codes, yeah.
harms that are much more severe to people, um, that is something that troubles me. But I think some of this has to do with what is your relationship to power, um, and that if you're in a position that has some power, um, that also can be grounding. I'm thinking back to a story back when I was writing my book about third parties in American politics, and I spent some time with Green Party organizers, not activists, organizers, who realized that at the local level, not at the congressional or national level, but at the local level, it was possible to run for office and get elected supporting green politics without necessarily having a party label, because most municipal elections are nonpartisan.
Right,
And so in the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico,
right.
which is probably like Portland, got a lot of very progressive people living in it, 3 out of the 5 members of the city council were Green Party members,
Right,
right?
right.
And Chris Moore, who was one of the best of that bunch, I remember him saying to me that um, his politics were, he was focused on things like affordable housing, that was a very important issue for him, was figuring out how to get more affordable housing in the city. And he remembers a Green Party activist coming to him and demanding that the city council issue a statement against NASA shooting some rocket into space that was going to be powered by plutonium.
I remember. Yeah,
Okay?
yeah,
Classic, far out there. Like, I mean, it's not that
yeah,
we shouldn't worry about that, right? Like, if that
yeah.
thing blew up, we'd all be sick. But what Chris said, he said back to this person was, tell you what, if you can get the other 2 members of the city council to support this, I'll support it too. And he
Right,
basically threw it back at them and said, this is your organizing challenge. You have to actually organize. It
right,
isn't just because it's the right position to take,
right,
right? Because Chris is thinking, Green Party, if we're gonna get elected again, we have to deliver in a tangible way locally. Saving people from a plutonium rocket, or that's a very abstract thing to worry about. And that's what a lot of this comes back to, is understanding what constituency you're operating in. So it could be in Portland that
oh yeah.
you know
Well, in Portland, in fact, it is very different in some ways than here, which is only 10 miles away because of the specific characteristics of both cities, right?
right, right,
Yeah. There's clearly commonality. I mean, in the end, there's much more
right.
commonality,
The
but we're
harder
not.
thing, the harder thing would be to convince progressive people in Portland who really, really do want the world to be saved from things like climate change,
Right.
that in order to win, they have to move away from Portland. Um,
Right.
I have a friend, Jonathan Smucker, who wrote a great book, Hegemony: How to. Longtime radical organizer in on the left and in places like Occupy. And in 2016, he moved back home to Lancaster, Pennsylvania,
Hmm.
and started organizing with a bunch of other people there. This is sort of it's a purple suburb, okay?
Right. Right.
It's quasi Amish country, and it happens to be an unusual place. It's not Pennsylvania, okay? We're not talking the reddest part of Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
but it's got a Republican congressman,
Right.
and it also has a lot of churches that have been very pro-refugee. So it's a mixed kind of place.
That sounds like here where I live. Go ahead.
Maybe, yeah. But the thing is that they started doing community organizing there. And they're probably one of the most advanced examples of the kind of thing we were talking about at the beginning, the Indivisible local group. Their group's called Lancaster Stands Up. And it has been a very important local force. They've now actually spawned a statewide effort called Pennsylvania Stands Up. And I think that's the fact is the people with like really well developed political intelligence, do you want to just stay in your safe clubhouse, right? Where the only conversations you're having are pure and comfortable? Or do you want to go meet people where they are?
Right,
Figure out
exactly.
how to move more of them into our column. And
Exactly.
that's the thing that's challenging. One last
Yeah,
thing, though, I have to say, Mark, and I saw this, when I was running Civic Hall in New York, we have a lot of refugees from Red America in New York.
yeah,
There are a lot of people who grow up in oppressive local social settings. Maybe they're gay and it's a Christian right kind of town, or maybe they're feminist and there's no way that women can be openly feminist in their community in the way you can in a big city.
right,
When those people need to leave those places, it isn't that easy to just say, oh, stay and do the hard work. So
right.
you got to recognize that, before you throw your thunder at some of these, people are coming from parts of America that are very oppressive too.
Yeah, of
And
course.
and so needing to come to safety or come to freedom makes sense too.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the idea, and of course, I know that it skips my mind for the moment, but there's somebody or there's some group that's actually actively organizing this idea of uh, retransplanting, people into actually having people
Yeah,
move.
Charles Blow wrote a book
Right.
about
It was Charles Blow.
doing that for
Right.
African Americans, and
Yeah, it's
there are
interesting.
others. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't, I think it's a great idea. I don't think, it's got a lot of possibility because that's asking quite a bit. But
Here's how
I,
you would do it if you want to actually do it in a significant way.
yeah,
The Biden administration, as part of the big infrastructure push that they're going to do, imagine if they started uh, hundreds more community colleges.
hmm,
I mean, the land grant universities are an
yeah,
example of this, right? In other words, make it possible for more people close to home to get a good education, an
uh,
affordable college education. Um,
yeah, it would make a big difference.
it could make a big difference, but this can only be done at the scale of government.
Right. Well, uh, we've got maybe 10 or 15 minutes
Mhm.
more. I would like to touch on the national situation a bit.
Yeah,
Um, how does this, I mean, I could throw you a big old softball like, how do you see the current political situation, right? But I'm not going to ask you that. I'm
yeah,
going to ask you, how do you, in very practical terms,
yeah.
this notion, how do you prescribe, if you will, how do you suggest that people who are engaged in real organizing work, right? How does that project toward the current national situation? Those things that really make a difference, like who's going to take the House in 2022, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
what is the relationship? This is kind of a four-part question. What is the relationship actually of progressives and of the left to the Democratic Party? Because this is you and I both know we've been around this our whole lives, right? And there's a great, to use an easy term, there's a great ambivalence, to say the least, between big parts of the progressive and leftist community and toward the Democratic Party. And yet, uh, there seems to be, over the last 20 years, a, a growing tendency among the left to understand that, um, you know, they have to work with the Democratic Party to some degree or another, because the third party at this point in American history ain't going to make it nationally. And especially when you have Trump and you've got now really a rogue Republican Party that's really
Well, if
kind of,
we're lucky, the Republicans turn into they split and we get a third party that way.
yeah, that would be great. I support that completely.
Yeah.
Uh, can you pick up from where I
Yeah,
left this rather ambiguous question?
I look, we're
It's a
it,
hard one.
it is a hard one, and I do think that the lessons of Obama are helpful in that what we do not have this time is a wholesale collapse of liberal public interest groups and most of the left into whatever Obama, wants them to
Correct.
do.
That's true.
There is nothing like that this time. Um, there are a couple of things that, I mean, yes, it's true. We do not have a lot of time, and the crises are multiplying. Um, and until COVID is behind us, it becomes, it's hard to do that much to galvanize people. I mean, I've been saying to folks, it's like we live in a two-dimensional version of our world. Everything is flattened.
We do.
We
Mm-hmm.
communicate through this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's dangerous to try and get people out on the street. I mean, I was amazed at how much street protest there was last summer. And that, by the way, we shouldn't forget the scale of the Black Lives Matter protests the summer of 2020 were way beyond anything that's been
Massive,
seen in terms
massive,
of mass protest in America.
massive.
They, it is also important, they spread so far that they also absolutely helped trigger a bigger backlash. I mean, the Blue Lives Matter protests that surfaced last summer in places that are also usually pretty quiet suburbs. I think
Yeah.
this thing works in tandem. Um, and I do think that the degree of polarization in the country hasn't gone down.
No.
We do have a moment of opportunity because what Biden is proposing is broadly popular. Um, and if they can deliver on ending COVID and beginning to deliver economic recovery, it's as best as you can hope for 2022 in terms of the core conditions of what that election will be about. If we're lucky, the fight between the Trump wing of the Republican Party and some other wing that's, weakens, and
Yeah.
you get a lot of Trumpy Republican, like far out candidates, and the Democrats can maybe hold some seats that otherwise they might lose in 2022. So those are your, and then the last thing of that I would say that is a cause for a little bit of optimism is we do have some politically creative younger leaders. When the Texas
Yes.
disaster started to unfold, um, Ted Cruz went on a vacation,
I heard about that.
and Beto O'Rourke and then Alessandra Ocasio-Cortez,
Right.
both of them activated these big grassroots organizing networks that they've built to bring relief. And that was like a moment of smart political action. And there have been times when we've had crises. I remember when the BP oil spill happened. Okay, giant national crisis. It's on the news every night. You can see the oil gushing from that thing on CNN. It was literally 24/7.
I remember very well.
And there was no creative political response.
No.
There was no, I mean, yes, a few people went down to the Gulf Coast to try and help,
No.
but there was no, the big environmental groups. I remember I did an article about this. The big environmental groups, I asked them, why aren't you pivoting your strategy to focus on this? Well, we decided our strategy for the year months ago, and all of our advertising buys have already been locked in.
Right, all six of us at the leadership level here, right?
Well, no, it was a big missed opportunity.
Yeah.
We now have, I think, more creative, more nimble, and more aggressive, frankly. Some of these younger leaders are more aggressive, which is good. They are not waiting for permission. We still have definite problems with the octogenarians who are still at the national leadership of the Democratic Party. Um, so will that change fast enough? Maybe not. That's a very frustrating thing to have to admit. Um, I mean, Nancy Pelosi was reelected by, there was no meaningful challenge to her inside
No.
the Democratic caucus. So, it's combined and uneven. It's like we're not necessarily getting all the things that we need fast enough um, to win in the terrain that we're stuck with.
If
Uh,
we, if we, yes, I understand. If we, there is one thing that I read, and I can't track it down. I remember reading it, and I've done like, 50 Google searches to try and retrieve it. Though it's probably in the archives of The Nation magazine. There was a stray a stray column shortly after Occupy, written by Adolph Reed, and basically what he said. I'm going to try and do him justice in a couple of sentences here and not distort what he said. What he said was a lot of the problems on people who self-identify as the left or progressives, if they have this notion in their head that there's going to be some spark somewhere, something's going to happen, and it's
yeah,
going to unleash, whatever it is in their head. It's going to unleash a general strike. It's going to unleash,
yeah.
it's going to unleash a avalanche for Sanders or whatever. And what Adolf said was, no, the way you create social change is by intensive, slow, methodical organizing.
Yeah, yeah,
You have to organize, it takes a long time. You have to compromise, you have to find your allies. And as you said, it's a matter of addition, not subtraction, right?
right. I
And
agree. You're not wrong.
here's I'm going to express to you
Mhm.
a frustration, an ambivalence that I have. Though I have to admit that my days of, what I do is mostly at a keyboard now. Though I've done other things in my past, right?
Sure.
But uh, um, but uh, the 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 question that really bothers me to some degree is that I personally, coming out of the 1960s left, right, the new left,
Mhm.
though I would say in my own defense, in a very healthy way. Okay, I was fortunate that in the 1960s I was never part of a sectarian, authoritarian group. Right,
Mhm.
I was
Mhm.
mostly associated with what you might call libertarian leftists. Okay,
Uh-huh.
so we were not, Maoists or anything like that, but we had a great antipathy towards the Democratic Party, right?
Mhm.
Which is in my genes.
Yeah.
And in my pants as well, but it's in my genes. Uh, and I'm not engaged in the day-to-day organizing that goes on, but it seems to me, from what I look at from the outside as a journalist, the left really has not come to the left that's even in the DSA or that has some foot in the Democratic Party really hasn't come to terms with what that means. And I don't know if that matters or not. And what I mean by that is that uh, I see, I have to be really careful there because I'm going to really uh, piss people off. Uh, I see a lot of uh, criticism, a lot of energy expended by the left on bashing now centrists. Okay, and first of all, I don't think they're centrists. I think just as a passing notion, most of the people that are called centrists are actually conservatives. Right? There's Joe Manchin is not a centrist Democrat; he's a conservative Democrat, as
Mhm.
many Democrats are. Right? Uh, And I'm completely conflicted about this, but I'm on the outside. It's like I say, well, yeah, you should really kick these people around. You should really give them hell. You should really these Democrats who are obstructing or who are not on board with everything or who are too slow or too compromised or too bureaucratic, whatever. Yeah, they need to be kicked around and they need to be blasted. On the other hand, if you're a progressive activist and you're working inside the Democratic Party, these, unfortunately or fortunately, these are also your allies, unless
Mhm.
you think you can win something with 25%, right? Which you cannot. Does that, is this purely in my head, or does that, if it is, it's okay, or is this something that has some resonance?
No, it resonates, but I think that the thing to remember about meaningful social change is that it generally is built by movements that shift the culture, and then the politicians follow.
Right.
It's not that the politicians lead anything.
I've
Uh,
noticed.
yeah, and that I mean, so raising the minimum wage to 15, which in some
Yeah,
places is not enough, and in other places is actually
yeah. The
not.
minimum wage in California is $14, by the way.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Um, or the movement for Black Lives.
Right.
I as you were talking, I was pulling up this book by Barbara Ransby, Making All Black Lives Matter, which is, I mean, it's already 2 years out of date, but this is about a movement that's been in motion for 10 years. And what's interesting is how distributed it is. It doesn't have a single headquarters, but it does have a lot of connective tissue. And she names names and organizations and people who serve those functions. How far that has come, right? I mean, it is changing the culture, and the culture is changing politics. Um, it will we get to reparations in the next 2 years out of Congress? I doubt it.
I don't
But,
think so.
but the number of things that are shifting along the way, can't be denied. So I don't think we should just focus on, the fact that the filibuster is going to, I mean, yes, it's a tool of the I mean, it is a tool of racism. It's the same way that the Electoral College and the structure of the Senate. These are all things that, the white men who wrote the Constitution, baked in. And we haven't gotten rid of them yet. At the same time, we have a federal structure, which means that a lot of things can also be done at the state level before they're done nationally. We got rid of child labor first, state by state, not nationally, right? I mean, many things that start in places and then spread rather than from Congress. So
Well, I think
this
that's
is
an
me. This is me. Basically giving you the best of the story.
no. That's an
The
excellent.
flip side. The
That
flip
is a
side.
good point. Go
Yes,
ahead.
the flip side of this, which is challenging, is the degree to which the concentration of money both distorts our politics and our organizing. Okay. So we have a financialized economy now, um, which is mostly about speculation. It's not about producing things.
All right.
And there's a lot of money sloshing around just looking for things to bet on.
Right.
Um, that's grown way out of proportion, but it distorts so many aspects of the economy. I mean, when the most talented computer programmers are spending their time figuring out how to get people to click a few more times on ads,
Right.
and make a billionaire a little bit more money,
Right.
um, or reorganize, how we do production and consumption through Amazon, and how much is Jeff Bezos personally worth?
200 billion.
Yeah.
But
Um,
who's counting? Go
well,
ahead.
it depends on what the stock is today.
All
But
right.
and then on the advocacy side, this is the part that's less visible to people, is how much those giant piles of money whether they still are in the hands of the billionaires or have now been converted into things called foundations, which are just ways of sustaining that power,
Right.
how much that affects who gets to lead, what gets focused on. I mean, we have no idea, really. There's very little visibility into that, but it is distorting all the time the kinds of things that get attention as
Right.
well. So the business of social change has also very much been financialized,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
that's a hard problem. I mean, I'm glad that more people are trying to think critically about these things. I'm not happy when I see it oversimplified,
I understand.
having been in the middle of these trenches long enough. Um, and I think there's an awareness that this is the last generation that has a shot at big structural changes, that whatever version of America, we head into the 2020s, that's the one we're stuck with
Uh,
as
Mika, you go
as things
ahead.
get worse. So
Yeah.
that's why I think you will see an intensity over the next few months of people pushing hard for big change.
Yes, and I'm gonna. It's a wonderful way to end this conversation, but I'm not going to end it. I'm going to ask you one more question
Absolutely.
because it comes out of what you said. It's I think that you've you've given us many wise words today and many important concepts, um, and I'm quite appreciative of them because I happen to agree with you. Uh, and I think it's absolutely imperative because time is short, and
Hmm.
we are in a crisis, and we are in an emergency situation, and this is kind of a last shot. And one could even argue that I would be comfortable arguing that it's actually much shorter than we think. That is to say, if the Biden administration stumbles, or whatever word you want to, or the uh, Republicans continue okay even with their divisions, or if the gentleman from Vermont happens, the other gentleman from Vermont, not the one with the mittens, uh,
Yeah.
decides to pass to the afterlife, right?
Oh, that guy. Yeah.
Yeah, who he looked pretty close the other day. I have to tell you, I didn't know that Senator Lee was. Uh, oh,
Right.
I didn't know that he was.
Democrats could lose their majority in the Senate, maybe. Yeah.
Wow, they also could lose it in the House as well,
Yeah.
right? And they could lose the House. I think easy. I think they could lose the House quite easily in
Oh, in
2022.
22, yes, but
Yeah, in
not
20.
by one or two people
Yeah,
passing away. Yeah.
yeah. So my question to you is, and this is something that I've been beating the drum on, which is the filibuster. And yeah, I mean, this is where my fantasy, and this is a pure fantasy, because the filibuster is not something that most people really know how it works, right? It's
Mhm.
not like you're missing unemployment check, right? Because there's been times during the last year where I said, well, God, why isn't this like Italy? Why aren't there, I know there's a pandemic, but why aren't there, a million people who've come out peacefully and said, we want this unemployment extended or whatever, right?
Sure.
Filibuster is a little bit more abstract, right? But but isn't that, I mean, independent of this conversation of
I would say,
long-term
Mark,
organizing, isn't that
absolutely.
a do or die?
It is do or die. And my read on what's going on there is that Schumer made a judgment, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader,
I've heard of him.
that he doesn't have the votes to eliminate the filibuster tomorrow.
Right.
The conditions for eliminating it require a degree of Republican obstruction that becomes so obvious
Right.
that even Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema say, ugh, this
Yeah.
isn't okay. That's otherwise we're going to be stuck in this middle place.
Yeah.
What's interesting is the Republicans may understand that if they obstruct too much, that the sledgehammer will come down on them. And it really comes down to, would Manchin and Sinema vote to get rid of the filibuster? They can do that. There's also one other wrinkle to this, which I've seen floated, which is it's not an all or nothing
Correct.
tool.
Yeah.
The filibuster, which used to be, you had to stand there and talk, like literally filibuster. They don't have to do that anymore. They just have to have 60 votes to close off someone blocking something coming to a vote. They could change that number from 60 to 55.
There's all
They
kinds
could
of,
they
yeah.
could they could say, well, if they obstruct for longer than this period, then it comes down to 50. In other words, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. They've already said that judicial nominees can be voted on by a majority. So you could carve out two or three votes a year. We don't need the majority. There are many ways to kind of half keep it and half get rid of it.
Right.
And I think they're aware of that. So, you could see a scenario where they're using reconciliation now to pass the recovery stuff. And then they start trying to do bigger things like immigration reform or
the minimum wage, which will drop
climate
out.
change, or you can think of a whole bunch of things. And the Republicans try obstructing.
Yeah.
And the weather gets better. And COVID starts to go down as a issue because we're beginning to see some real improvements. Well, spring comes to America and a lot of people, your million people marching, they'll be back. I think they were already there last summer in the middle of the pandemic. But there's a tremendous amount of pent up fury.
Yeah.
This is the thing I think about often is the incredible strain that people are under, all the people who have to keep working, right? From the guys delivering, food for DoorDash and Grubhub to teachers and medical workers. I mean, if you just look around and there are all these stories of despair of people at the breaking point or beyond who are still just managing to get by. And they're getting a little bit of relief here and a little bit of relief there, but not enough. There's an explosion waiting, I think.
I agree.
And I don't think this is the Adolph Reed version where it's like some magic spark. I
Yeah.
think it'll be organized.
Yeah.
It was organized around the Black Lives Matter protests last year. There was a deliberate decision by the movement for Black Lives to resurface. And a lot of local leadership. That wasn't just random people doing protests. Okay. So I think the capacity is there and the kindling in terms of pent up fury at all the death, all the failure. And what is it they say about when do big revolutions happen?
When
When
expectations are on the rise.
expectations on the rise and middle class leadership,
Right.
right? It isn't the most oppressed necessarily. It's often the people who have reason to have
Mm-mm.
rising expectation. So I can see a scenario where it really boils over in a few months and Congress is under pressure to move.
From your lips to Joe Manchin's little
Well, and to
ears.
Pat Leahy's doctors.
We hope he hangs in there.
Oh, God.
Micah, thanks for
Been
such
great, Mark.
a
Absolutely.
great talk. Oh, okay, stop.